So today I'm going to talk about endgames. This will be review for some of you. I've covered some of these things before. For some of you, this may be the first time you've ever seen anything like it. And although technically it's a little bit advanced, pretty much most of the things Dvoretsky covers is a little bit more advanced, but some of these are pretty simple. There'll be rules of thumb that I'm going to show you. So hopefully it makes some sense. Okay. So I'm going to start off with pretty much the simplest endgame you can have is just one more piece than is necessary for a draw, just a pawn. Okay. So king and pawn. Now, there's a concept in these pawn endgames of key squares to control, to be on. So in this position, White's king is fortunately in front of the pawn. I'm not sure if you do that, by the way, but in king and pawn versus king endgames, you want your king in front of your pawn, not behind it. Okay, you want it in front. It can be counterintuitive because one of the things you'll learn about endgames is you want to push your pawns to queen, right? So you might just push it as far as you can. But in these endgames, you don't want to do that. You want your king in front first. And you'll see why later, because your king is going to help shepherd that pawn to be a queen. Okay. So anyway, there are in this case there are only 3 squares that White needs to put the king on in order to win. So what are the key squares for White here? Does anyone happen to know? White's king needs to be on one of the 3 squares.
C5.
C6 is one of them. What are the other 2? So C6, by the way, you probably can't see notation too well. It's this square. Now what else? D6. And what? Yeah, E6.
That's specific for this scenario.
So as long as the pawn is on the 4th rank or lower, those are the only 3 squares. Your king has to control those in order to win. Now we'll see there's an exception if your pawn's further advanced. Okay, but in this case, White has to put the king on one of those squares to win. So as you can probably tell, it matters whose move it is. Okay, if it's White's move, White actually can't win. Okay, because Black has what's called the opposition, and that's yet another concept. The opposition is when your opponent has to move. It's sort of like a zugzwang type situation. It's like trying to sidestep each other, and when your opponent has to move, you just mirror them and they can't get past you. So if it's White to move here, you can play king there, but you can't get access to one of these squares because Black can just play here and just mirror you. And if you, this would be a huge blunder, by the way, because now White would play king e6, and now that you have one of these key squares, you win. And just to illustrate that, let's say for instance king here, White plays king here. Say for instance here, here, and White now controls the queening square. So no matter what you do, you're just going to advance and then make a queen. Right? For instance, it doesn't matter. You can play king e8. You'll just keep pushing, and then you'll make a queen. But on the other hand, if Black plays correctly here and plays king e7, White has no way forward. If you go here, Black just goes back. If you go king f5, same story. And pushing the pawn doesn't accomplish anything either. Just play here, d6. And then, does anyone know how Black draws here?
King to d8.
So why are you playing king to d8?
Because then oh wait, never mind.
I didn't say you were wrong. I'm just asking why.
So that he can't promote.
So you're correct, Elliot. But the point is, after king e6, you get the opposition by playing king e8, right? And now, if d7, you move the king over, and White has a problem here because the only way to defend your pawn is king d6, right? Any other king move, you lose it. But now it's stalemate. Black can't move. So this would just be a draw. Okay. So keep in mind these 3 key squares, basically 2 squares in front of the pawn. You need to control one of those 3. Okay. Now, there's an exception if your pawn's really far advanced. Okay, if it's on the 5th rank or further, you have more key squares. So it makes it easier to win if you have the pawn, or harder to defend if you don't. So in this case, there are I guess 6 key squares really. What are those key squares here?
A6, A7.
Yeah, A7.
B.
Yeah, these 3 are all key squares for sure, and then yeah, C6. So in this case, in the last position, it mattered whose move it was, see who would win. But in this case, it doesn't matter whose move it is. It's a win for white no matter what. For instance, if it's white's move, you play King A6, say King A8, B6, King B8, and B7. And if you go King C7, there's King A7, and you win. The problem for black is you can't go backwards. That's why it's a win for white. If black could go King to B9, then it would be a draw, okay? But there's no B9, so that's the problem. And again, it doesn't matter whose move it is. If it was black's turn, if King C8, just King A7, and you win. B6, B7, Queen. So remember, if your pawn's on the 5th rank or further, then you have more key squares. Okay. So let's take a look at an exercise of this, using these key squares in action. Now there's a lot of variations here, but it's the same concept. You want your king in front of your pawn. That's important. So white starts with King F2, and white wants to take that H pawn on H5, right? Now H4, the problem for black is that if you try to defend your pawn, you're too late, and white also has the king in front of the pawn perfectly placed anyway. So king takes the pawn, and black's lost. And it's lost because white can put the king on one of these squares, so there's no way to defend. For instance, King G7, just play King G5, and it's game over, right? Because you're controlling the squares in front of the pawn. Okay, so King F2, black has to play H4, and you'll see why this is a bit tricky, actually. White has to play King G1. This probably looks surprising, but the point is if you play King F3, black has H3. And it's a draw, unfortunately. For instance, let's say you play G4, black king moves over, and it's a draw because you don't control the 3 squares in front of the pawn, right? You can't get your king to these squares, so black's okay. Just for example, to play it out further, say you play G5, King G7, King H5, say King H7, and it's just a draw, right? King F6, King F8, and white, again, just like we saw before, has to stalemate or lose the pawn. So that's why white plays this weird King G1 move. And the reason you want to do this is to go to round H2 and capture the pawn. And again, you want to put your king in front of the pawn. That's why it's so important. So now H3, trying for the same trick. Now, by the way, G takes H3 would be a mistake because generally speaking, if it's just a rook pawn and 2 kings, as long as black can get the king to the corner, it's going to be a draw. So for example, King D8. And here it doesn't matter that white controls the squares in front of the pawn. The problem is that you're going to stalemate black if you push your pawn all the way. Just for example, I'll just play it out. So these rook pawns are often exceptional. And you can see the problem here. If you play H7, it's just a draw. So that's why H3. But now we play G3. So can someone tell me why you play G3 and not G4? Why is G4 a mistake? Yeah?
Because your pawn's too far forward.
Exactly, yeah. You're pushing the 3 squares in front of the pawn further away from your king and closer to black's king. So black will be able to draw. Just for example, King D7, King H2. And we have a draw because you're not controlling these 3 squares. So going back, that's why G3. Now white's king can get to G4 and win. So King D7, King G4, and white's winning now. Because white has the opposition and black has to give up one of those 3 squares. Let's say you play King F6, King H5, and white wins. So pretty sneaky, right? it might look really complicated or mysterious, especially if you see someone playing this. You might wonder, how this happens, But you just have to know this general concept. You want your king in front of the pawn. You want to control those squares. So that's why these things happen. In triangulation. So this is a very useful and really common technique in these endgames. The whole trick here is to gain the opposition. So right now it's white's move, but the problem is you want it to be black's move here so you can get your king in, right? Because if it were black's move, you can get your king in. Just for the record, c6 looks good, but it doesn't win. Does anyone see why it doesn't work?
Because if black takes the pawn, then your king would probably want to take the pawn, and then.
Well, believe it or not, if black takes the pawn, then white's winning again, due to some sneakiness, because you can play king c5. And now let's say, for example, you play king c8. You take, king b8, b7, and we queen. Right? But black has better defense than taking the pawn.
They moved to C8.
Yeah, king c8 actually. And unfortunately, white can't win. Even though you can get a protected passed pawn with c7, black plays king d7, and you can't make progress. Because if you ever try to approach, then you're just going to stalemate black. For example, you do something like this, it's just stalemate. And also, unfortunately, if you take, then you can't win this endgame. For example, king b8. You're not controlling the key squares in front of the pawn. And stalemate again, right? So, okay. So instead of c6, we start with king e5. And the whole point here is we're going to try to lose a tempo. Okay. So, king c6. If you play anything else, then white's king is going to get in. Like if you play king c8, then king d6, and white's king has gotten in. So king c6, king d4, king d7, and king d5. So now we have the exact same position, but it's black's move this time, which is what we wanted. So see that little triangulation maneuver we did there? You just moved your king back and forth, making a little triangle. So we call that triangulation. And here black's lost. For example, king here, play king d6. Now you can't play king d8 because of c6. And if you take, you queen. So king b8, king d7, king a8, c6. And we win because if black takes, we play king c7. And then b7, b8 queen, and we checkmate, right? c5, b7, and win. Do you have a question?
Would you still win if the king takes the pawn?
Let's see. King takes pawn here? It looks like you would because king b8, b7.
That's what I thought, because we can go around.
Yeah. It just takes a little bit longer to checkmate, but yeah. Yeah, just slightly longer, but it does win, so. Yep. So due to that triangulation, white gets a win there. Okay, now the rule of the square. Has anyone heard of this one? I know Lucas has mentioned this one before several times. Yeah? You guys know this rule? So, based on the rule of the square, if it's white's move, can black catch the pawn?
No.
So why not?
It's not the square. Yeah, the king is.
Yeah, if it was white's move, white would play b4, and the black king would not be in the square, right? Now, the square that we're talking about here is this one. Okay.
Oh, that's right.
So the rule of the square is that you draw a square to the queening square, and then you draw it just the exact same length. It's a square, right? So same number of squares. You draw a square like that. And if your opponent's king is within that square, then he can catch your pawn. But if not, then you promote. Okay. So if it's white's move, you win because the king is not in the square. But if it's black's move, then it's a draw because black can play, for instance, king here. And now the king is within the square, right? So now it's a draw. Just to show you, b4, king f4, b5, king e5, b6, king d6. See how black catches it? But unfortunately, if black's king If it wasn't black's move, then you wouldn't be able to get in the square of the pawn, and white would win. So the whole point of this rule is just to simplify your calculation. So if you're trying to figure out whether to arrive at an endgame like this, you can quickly just look, okay, is my king in the square of the pawn? No, I can't catch it. Yes, then you can. So it's just a shortcut. It's pretty handy. Yeah. Now there's also something called the floating square rule. This one's actually pretty handy. So a lot of times in endgames, you'll have separated passed pawns like this. Now the floating square rule talks about if you can catch both the pawns or not, because they'll try to divert you from one another, right? So what you do this time is draw a square with both pawns, right? And see if it reaches the end, right? So here, it's 5 squares across, 5 squares down. So if the square reaches the end of the board, then you can queen by force, right? So in this case, it doesn't matter whose move it is. For example, you can play a4, king b4, e4, and you see that the white king can't catch both. If you take e3, and your king's now outside the square of the pawn. So black wins. But let's look at another example. So this time, our square is just 4 squares. So in this case, it doesn't matter whose move it is, white can catch both pawns. For example, d4, you play king c4, a4, king d4, and the pawns are too close. a3, king c3, and white gets them.
What would be?
What's that? And yeah, and once white takes the last black pawn, you'll be able to win with those 2 connected passers. Okay. And here's just another fun example. So in this case, black's pawns don't reach the end of the board, so white can catch them. But even though black's king is super close, white's pawns actually, the square reaches the end of the board, so white's going to promote by force here, believe it or not. And it doesn't matter whose move it is. If it's black's move, you're definitely lost. But if it's white's move, king c3, a3, might look scary because you can't take the c4 pawn, but you just go king c2. And black's lost because if you keep pushing your pawns, you'll lose them. c3, you just take it and you can catch the a pawn. And if a2, you play king b2. c3, you just take it. And the problem for black is you can't move the king, because if you play king h7, there's f7, and you can't control the queening square anymore. And the same story if you go king h8, just f7. There's nothing you can do. White's just going to queen. So that's a pretty useful rule too. So instead of calculating if the 2 separated pawns can win, you can just use this floating square rule. It's just a little bit different than the square rule. Any questions on that? Cool. Now this one I just recently learned. It's how to defend against 3 connected passed pawns if you have just a king. Now it might look pretty intimidating facing a wall of 3 advancing pawns, but believe it or not, you can defend this. In this case, you can start with king b1. And believe it or not, white actually wins this because no matter which pawn black advances, white has a defense. So let's say, for example, b3. Now you can play king b2, and black can't advance either pawn, and now it's Zugzwang, right? If you play king h7, f7, and same story, white wins. Okay, let's look at a3. Now you can play king a2. Can't play b3 because you take the pawn, so you have to play c3. But now king b3. And again, no matter which pawn black advances, he loses it. And finally, it's the same thing if c3, you play king c2, and if a3, king b3. So, defending against 3 connected passers, just remember to put your king in the center 2 squares away. And by the way, black would be winning if he had moves to waste, but there's no moves to waste because, like talked about before, if king f7 or h7, you just advance the other pawn. just to show you why king b1 is the only move that works, if you play king b2, then it no longer works because black can play b3. Now if you play king a3, there's c3, and black wins, right? King a4, b2, and there's a promotion coming. So this is pretty handy. So even if you're facing 3 connected pass pawns, you can still defend as long as your opponent can't make time marking moves, can't just move back and forth. All right, now let's look at another common pawn endgame, and that's queen versus advanced pawn. Yeah.
So this is how
So-
that's
I'm sorry? What's that?
this is how to win is white, right?
Well, it's not always winning. It's just queen versus a pawn on the 7th, right? So this one is super useful because I've had lots of endgames that end up this way. You're in a situation where you have to figure out, do I want to go for this endgame where I queen first, but they're about to, they have a pawn on the 7th, you know? All right, so this is a really useful rule of thumb to know. Now, there's only really one exception to these, and I'll talk about that later. But when it's a knight pawn or a center pawn, the queen is able to beat the passed pawn. Okay, and that's because you can check black several times and then advance your king, and kind of reiterate to advance your king closer. By the way, white has to get the king next to the pawn, or else you can't win. Okay, and just to show you how the winning method works, you would just check, and black doesn't want to put the king in front of the pawn because then you can move your king closer. So black would want to play something like king b1 to threaten the queen. But now you keep checking, and the queen moves a little bit closer until we get to a situation like this, where the queen gets really close, and not only is it checking the black king, but it's attacking the pawn. There's no king b1 because you win the pawn. So now black has to put the king in front of the pawn, and you can move the king one step closer. And you just do this over and over again, because now black's going to again threaten the queen, and then you just start the process over again, say here, check, 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 and again force the same thing, right? King f1, you lose the pawn, so king d1, and then you move closer. So that's the winning method if it's knight or center pawn. It doesn't matter if it's a knight pawn. By knight pawn, I mean G or B, because that's where the knights start at the beginning of the game. So you'll hear those referred to as knight pawns. So it doesn't matter if it's center or knight pawn, the queen wins against the advanced pawn. But it's not the same story if it's a rook or a bishop pawn. Rook pawn is A or H, and a bishop pawn is either C or F, okay? So in this case, it's C pawn, and white can't win, believe it or not, because the same method doesn't work here. So for example, queen b4, king a1, queen a3, queen b3. This time, black doesn't have to play king c1 as the problem. Black can play king a1.
Oh.
And you can't take the pawn because then it's stalemate, black has no moves. But if you don't take the pawn, then there's nothing you can do productive here. You can't move your king closer, king d4, king c4, because black just queens. So in this case, there's nothing you can do. And it's the same story if it's a rook pawn. There's just a stalemate. I don't have the exact position, but you would just hide your king in the corner. If you're not convinced, you can set up the position, play it against stockfish. Wow, it's really raining. So that's a really handy rule to know. It's helped me. I mean, keep in mind too, when you're playing a long time control game, usually when you hit the end game, you're going to be low on time. I hope you're low on time for the most part, right? So these kind of rules of thumbs where you don't have to calculate every single move will save you a lot of time. Okay, so these are really handy rules of thumb. And this one is just a general note about pawn structure. Okay, it's really useful, this concept of restraining your opponent's pawns. Okay, so white to play can play g5 here. And despite being down a pawn, white has a winning endgame because white's single pawn restrains all three of those black pawns. You can't play f6 or h6 because you just take it and win, right? So this concept is very important in endgames. So sometimes even if you have a minority on one side of the board, you can still restrict your opponent's pawns with something like that.
Why can't black just move their king to C8?
So king c8, you can play, I don't know, king e5, and if king d7, you play king d5, and you win because normally, if all the kingside pawns were gone, it would be a draw, right? Because white doesn't control the 3 key squares in front of the pawn. But in this case, it's different. Let's say king d8, king c6. Note that this time there's no stalemate. Black has to move a pawn. So it doesn't matter what you do, say h6 or h5. Let's just say h5 because maybe black's hoping you won't know en passant. But you can just take, and then you checkmate. So in this case, there was no stalemate, so it ends up being a win. Yeah?
It only works for the thing where it's like 1 pawn versus 3. It only works if it's in the middle, right? Like we can't be on both sides.
Oh, you mean black's playing g6 there?
No, if the white pawn is on H or F.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. If white had a rook pawn, it wouldn't work.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, speaking of pawn structure, there's also this concept of breakthroughs, right? So even if it doesn't look like you can create a passed pawn, a lot of times you can. So this following position illustrates one of the issues of having doubled pawns is that it's hard to make passed pawns out of them. But nonetheless, black can sacrifice to make one. So black can start by c4, and now let's say king g3, play c5, h4, play b4. Okay, let's say king f4, you play a4. Let's say g5, let's say take, take. Now you can play b3, and black gets a passed pawn. C takes, and black wins, right? White's king is outside of the square of the pawn, right? But going back, white can actually defend this if it's white to play. If it's white's move, white has a way of defending. Any ideas?
C4.
Excellent, yeah. So the problem for black is if you take, you have triple pawns, but they're not very useful, right? White can go king g3, and actually white's the one winning here because these triple pawns can't do anything and you can make your own passer. And likewise, if you play b4, it doesn't matter either. White just goes back, and you can't make a passer. Say a4, king f4. There's no b3 here because you just take, and you haven't made a passed pawn. So there's no way to make it, and you just lose. So that's one of the issues of having double pawns in the endgame.
Warren, can you show why the white's winning with those pawns locked, why white's winning on the king side?
Sure. So well, let's say, for example, king f6. The problem here for black is that white has what's called an outside passed pawn. Okay. What that means is you can distract the opponent king to the other side of the board, and then you take all of their pawns, right? Now, you can't do the same thing as before trying to stalemate, because black would play b3, and then he'd run out of pawns, right? So you start by h4. So you're not trying to queen your g-pawn. You're just going to use that as a distraction, like a decoy. So for example, king g6, you play g5, take, take. And now you wander to the queen side and you raid all the pawns. King g6, king d6, king g5, king c6, king f5, king c5. And you can probably see that white's just winning, right? King e5, king b4, and with it's going to end up being 3 extra pawns. That's plenty to win. So having this outside passed pawn is an important idea in endgames. So you'll use it as a distraction so you can take all the pawns on the other side of the board.
By the way, guys, if black makes a move here, like king d4, how does white hold on to the 3 pawns? How does white keep all 3 pawns here?
All 3 pawns?
Yeah, all 3 pawns. There you
Yeah.
Yeah, c3 works. Black has to go back because if you go forward, you push. And your king's outside the square of the pawn, right? So you go back, white takes, and yeah. The 3 extra pawns, they're very handy. Okay. Now we're gonna take a look at what's called Steinitz's rule. Anyone heard of Steinitz's rule before? So the idea is it's good in endgames. It's a really positive thing to have pawns that can still move 1 or 2 squares. Basically, in king and pawn endgames, you want pawns on the original square if you can have it, because they have the option of going 1 or 2 squares. So basically, they'll give you the tempo no matter what, right? So if you need to waste a move, you can move it 1 square and then move it again. Or if you don't want to waste a move, you can just move it 2 squares at once, right? So this is really handy, and we're going to see an example right here. It's really cool. So we'll start king f4, king e7. For the record, black has a more challenging move in g6, but that doesn't work either. You just play h6, g5, and king e3, and you're gonna have a breakthrough on the queen side like we saw before. Say king g6, a4, and you get a pass pawn on the a file. But okay, let's look at king e7. This is a little bit trickier. King g5, king g6, and here's where it's super useful that we have this move to waste. a3. And the whole point is we want black's king to be on g8 when we get a pass pawn. So king f8, a4. So if we go back a move, if it was let's see. Yeah, if it was white to play here, this would just be a draw, because black's king can move to the queen side to defend the d8 square. But as it is, black has to play king g8, because that's the only way to defend the g pawn, right? Now you play c5, and you break through. If b takes c5, a5, and you promote the a pawn. So d takes a5, takes b6, and even though you sacked all your pawns, you have this passed d pawn. King f8, d7, and black is just 1 tempo short. You queen with check, and you make another queen with check, and white wins. Right? You can move the king after to defend the queening square, or just play queen h1. It doesn't matter too much. So it's really helpful to have that extra tempo, having your pawn on the original square. Okay. Let's look at another example of this to help you understand. So this is a really cool example. So let's evaluate this endgame. And the way you do it using Steinitz's rule is who has more pawns on their original square. So it's the same in this case, right? Black has pawn on h7 and b7. That's 2. And white has b2 and a2. So for the record, if white's pawn were on h2 instead of h3, white would be winning no matter whose move it was. But as it is, since it's equal, in this case, whoever move it is wins. Okay. So let's say it's black's move. You play king e5, king f3, and another thing you want to do in these endgames is you want to hold on to your pawns until the last moment that can move 1 or 2 squares. So you wouldn't want to play h6 or h5 because that pawn's on the original square, so don't touch it. So the only pawn that hasn't moved, that has moved, is a5, is the a pawn. So we have to play a5 here. Now white has to play h4 because white doesn't want to touch b2 and a2. Now a4, h5, h6. So now unfortunately white has to move one of those pawns on a2 or b2, because if you move your king, you lose the e4 pawn. So b4, a takes, b6, and b5. So notice how black has that tempo here. Having that extra move to waste meant everything. So if it's black's move, black won. Now let's go back. Now if it's white to move, white wins. So king f3, king e5. Now what should white play here? Remember, you want to keep your pawns on the original squares as much as you can.
h4.
Right, h4. So you want to keep a2 and b2 there as long as you can. a5, h5, a4, h6, b6. Now we play b4. No matter what black does, it's going to be zugzwang. So a takes, b5, b4. And black has to move the king away from the f4 pawn.
So when white played h4, if black were to play h5, that just accelerates the zugzwang?
Yeah, if h5, it doesn't much matter. You can play.
Still the same thing.
Yeah, you can. In this case, you can play b4, and then if b5, there's a3, and again it's zugzwang. If b6, you play a4, and it zoogs along again. A5, B5, or B5, A5, and yeah, black's in tempi. So this one's a really handy rule, because these king pawn endgames can look really tricky. You don't know how many tempi you want or want to be able to waste. So just keep that in mind in general. If you have pawns in the original squares, leave them there, because later on you'll have the option of moving it 1 or 2 squares. That's really useful. Okay, and one last one, and this one's really helpful idea to know. When you have 2 connected passers, and you're also trying to defend against protected pass pawn. So it may look like this is a draw because black can't take the H pawn, or any of the pawns, because the other one went queen. And it looks like white can't help shepherd the pawn because if you move your king to E5, then black plays C3, C2, and queens, right? But white can help shepherd the pawn to the end of the board using the king. So let's see how white does this. So king D4, king G4, H4. Black can't take G3 because then you play H5 and queen, right? So king H5, king E3, king E4. The king's in the square of the pawn, so the black pawn isn't at risk of queening. King H5, king F4. Again, white's safe because we're in the square of the pawn, so C3 doesn't work. King H6, G4. So now we're advancing the pawns. H5, king F3, G5. Yep, we use triangulation again. King G7, G6. Now it matters which pawn you advance here. H6 would be a mistake. And yeah, the problem is king G6. So the thing is, white's king needs to go to H5 here, right, to advance the pawns. But that square would be too far away, right? G5 is closer. So whenever you have the connected pass pawns, just advance whichever one makes a hole that's closer to your king, right? In this case, G5 is closer than H5. So that's why we play G6. Now king F6, king E4. We're still in the square of the pawn, so black can't advance it. King F3, king F4. We use triangulation again. And finally, we go king G5. So now we're outside the square of the pawn, so black advances. But the 2 connected passers were able to force through. So H6, king G8, king F6, H7. And you can see that white's queening no matter what. King H8, or G7. King F7 also works. And black's lost. Queen. And then checkmate. So 2 connected passers against king is very dangerous. So you can even abandon your lookout for that pass pawn your opponent has if you can force through your connected passers. So that's an important idea too. So any questions about these guys? And these are a lot of rules of thumb, a lot of variations we've looked at. So feel free to look at the recording later. I also want to make just 2 general points about endgames. I would say the most common mistake I see people make in endgames is not activating their king. For sure. It either comes from not recognizing the transition from middle game to an end game. Queens and pieces have been traded off, and you kind of just forget that. Okay, but in the end game, it's really important to centralize your king and get it involved. Okay, it's your king is end game is probably worth approximately 4.5 pawns or so. So almost a rook. So I hope in the end game you're not just leaving your rooks in the corner doing nothing, right? So you shouldn't leave your king in the corner doing nothing either. I've seen so many games where maybe you haven't castled in the middle game and queens and pieces are off, and I see someone castle anyway. I've seen that very, very often. But you don't want to do that because then you're putting your king in the corner in the end game where it doesn't belong, right? So just keep that in mind. Get your king active in the end game. All right. And another thing is if you want to improve your end game play, one of the best things you can do is not only just get knowledge with specific positions or patterns with like Dvoretsky's book, but also just working on your calculation. A lot of end games are just calculation. It's really important to work on that. So doing puzzles and practicing not moving the pieces when you're analyzing something, that's important. Okay. All right. So that's all I have for today.